can you help me understand how a kid growing up in a suburb of Charlotte, rural area in North Carolina, can be radicalized by the Islamic State?
Fact is that a young man like that in Mint Hill could easily go to numerous sites on the internet.
Can you tell me where else in the United States that such radicalization is happening?
This has happened all over the country.
What role is the internet playing, you believe, in the radicalization of American-born youth?
Well, the Islamic State group has frequently called upon Muslims in the United States specifically to carry out lone wolf jihad terror attacks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you on the panel for what you've shared today. And you know, while there's been a lot of talk about what we don't know, and we don't know this world or we don't know that world, let me tell you what happened in my world, in the 8th District of North Carolina. This past year, in late 2025, the FBI, in coordination with local law enforcement, arrested an 18-year-old in Mint Hill, North Carolina, who was plotting to carry out a deadly New Year's Eve attack in support of ISIS. According to the DOJ, this 18-year-old, Christian Sturdivant was his name, sought to become a martyr for ISIS. And Mr. Spencer, I just want to give you a chance to share. Can you help me understand how a kid growing up in a suburb of Charlotte, rural area in North Carolina, can be radicalized by the Islamic State?
Mr. Harris, this is a very important issue that law enforcement and intelligence agencies in the U.S. have been entirely remiss and have ignored altogether. Fact is that a young man like that in Mint Hill could easily go to numerous sites on the internet and quite possibly to people within his own community who would tell him that the Islamic State, ISIS, represents authentic Islam and that violence against unbelievers is a duty that he needed to carry out. This is something that ISIS recruiters say all over the world. They were able to attract thousands of Muslims from 100 different countries when they had their caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and this was because their claim to Islamic authenticity rang true among all too many Muslims, and nobody is countering that.
Well, and I know this happened in Mint Hill, as I mentioned. Can you tell me where else in the United States that such radicalization is happening?
This has happened all over the country. We had the Boston Marathon murders that were two young Muslims, once again, who were thought to be moderate at one time. And we had the Fort Hood massacre, San Bernardino, Chattanooga. The list goes on, Orlando, Florida. The list goes on and on and on. And these are young Muslims in the United States who come to believe, for reasons that nobody has ever investigated fully, that this is the authentic expression of their faith.
And what role is the internet playing, you believe, in the radicalization of American-born youth?
Well, the Islamic State group has frequently called upon Muslims in the United States specifically to carry out lone wolf jihad terror attacks by just starting to murder people at random when they get the opportunity. And so because they have this claim of Islamic authenticity, it's all too easy for a young man to go online and see that and think that he will be receiving a reward from Allah for carrying it out.
Well, as a pastor, for myself, I believe, obviously, that religious liberty is critically important and something we've got to be willing to do what we have to protect. However, I also recognize that a person's religious liberty doesn't mean they can impose their religious liberty onto others. So let me ask you this, Mr. Spencer. How do we balance our respect for religious liberty with the threat you see posed by Sharia law?
Seems to me we have to be able to say to the Muslim community that they're perfectly free to practice their religion, except where, in particular, it contravenes other existing American laws. For example, there were a couple of doctors in Detroit a few years back who were put on trial for practicing female genital mutilation. And their defense was that this was part of their Islamic faith and that they were carrying out as their part of their religious practice. And a judge ultimately threw the case out, saying, yes, indeed, this contravenes religious freedom, and we have to understand that it would be unconstitutional to ban female genital mutilation because it's part of Islam. And so the rights of those girls whose lives are destroyed, they don't matter at all. and that's Sharia.
Well, and one thing in just the last 40 seconds that concerns me is the creation of these Islamic tribunals that seek to mediate disputes between Muslims and bind Muslims in the United States to Sharia law. We've seen them popping up in cities like Dallas, which led Governor Abbott to request law enforcement officials to investigate these entities. And Mr. Gillay, in just the last 15 seconds, would Sharia law-based institutions such as these potentially violate federal law, and if so, how so?
They would probably not violate federal law, that is particularly a statute, but what they would do is in some of their rulings, if their rulings were enforced by civil courts, such as the courts in Texas, as Texas law would currently suggest, then that would violate certainly American constitutional liberties, including due process, equal protection, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Scanlon, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. It's been an interesting discussion of one religious minority attempting to impose its beliefs on the general population, which of course would violate the First Amendment. And I think that our colleague, Mr. Cohen, did raise an interesting point about the greatest danger perhaps lying not with Sharia law, but with white Christian nationalism, which is very different than patriotic Americans who happen to be Christian, but the white Christian nationalist movement, which is embodied in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 manifesto. I mean, which we've seen over the last year, the Trump administration has embraced, both by putting people who drafted that document into the administration, but also by implementing its plans. And I just run through a few of them. The plan calls for a total abortion ban, which is not something that people of all faiths believe in, including the overturning of FDA approval for mifepristone and restricting access to contraception. These beliefs seek to reverse LGBTQ plus equality, including same-sex marriage, and making it very difficult for people to access gender-affirming care. The policy promotes a very narrow definition of family as a married mother and father, often portraying single motherhood as an aspect or a cause of social decay. It proposes, and the Trump administration has moved to abolish the Department of Education, promoting school privatization through vouchers and trying to fund private religious schools. With respect to civil service, we've seen the moves to reclassify tens of thousands of nonpartisan federal civil servants and replace them with political appointees willing to swear allegiance to this particular ideology. Impacts on the environment, et cetera. There's a whole host of ways here in which this particular ideology has been embedded in our government in recent times, despite the fact that it does pose a threat to underlying constitutional values, other people's religious beliefs. So I think that keeps coming to mind as we have this conversation about having the respect for religious liberty and people being free to practice their own religion, but they're not supposed to be imposing their own religion on others. Professor Soman, can you speak for the benefit of my Republican colleagues, can you explain how the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause and the Free Establishment Clause work together to prohibit the government from imposing one group of Americans' religious views on another?
Sure, absolutely. So certainly the Free Exercise Clause prevents direct coercion of religion of any kind, forcing people to engage in religious practices that they don't want to engage in. The Establishment Clause prevents the establishment of any kind of official religion, including the kind of theocracy we see in Iran or in Saudi Arabia. And also relevant to this case, to the legislation we're talking about today, the Free Exercise Clause in decisions by Supreme Court justices, including by conservative ones in the case of Carson versus Macon dealing with yes school vouchers, they have ruled that it violates the free exercise clause to exclude people or organizations based on their religious beliefs from benefits that are available to other people, even though the state did not have an obligation to create school vouchers under the Constitution. In Maine, when Maine did so, in Carson, the Supreme Court, in a decision joined by all 6 conservative justices, correctly ruled that excluding religious schools simply because they're religious violates the First Amendment, and the same thing would be true for an effort to exclude Muslim immigrants in the United States simply because they're adherents of Sharia law. I think this jurisprudence, which conservatives accept almost everywhere else, applies here as well.